I'm Marie. I debated for South for 4 years and I coached at South and Sanford Middle School. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the basics of using abolition as a debate argument, specifically as a critique. If you aren't super familiar with abolition, I definitely recommend that you check out my History of Prison Abolition video. In that video, I went over the basics of what abolition is and a pretty brief history of the movement, and it'll provide you some really good context for understanding this video. So the central question of abolition is this idea of reform versus abolish. Should we continue reforming the criminal justice system? Meaning, should we continue engaging in these small fixes, like decriminalizing sex work or marijuana, implementing body cameras, or diversifying the police force, and believe that they are the way that we are going to achieve meaningful change and equality? Or should we abolish prisons and police altogether and begin with an entirely new system? And it's a really complicated question. And the first instinct people have when they hear that is, well, we have seen positive change in society from reforms, right? And the easy answer to that is that yes, some material gains have been made. Obviously, people are no longer working on plantations. That is a good thing. But the fundamental structures have not shifted, meaning that Black people are still systematically disenfranchised, meaning they can't vote. They're segregated into areas with pollution, which leads to low health outcomes. They lack access to economic opportunities because they were never compensated for the fact that they literally built America. Other minorities face struggles as well, obviously. Native Americans are continually crowded into smaller and smaller reservations, and we're seeing a really bad epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And reforms have repeatedly proven to be failures when it comes time to actually change the heteropatriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist society that we live in. And the idea is that if we continue to invest in reforms and we continue to see reforms as really the only solution for our problems, we get further and further from the possibility of abolition and from the possibility of actually meaningfully transforming the oppressive structures that underpin our society. A good way to think of it is right now we are about 3 weeks or a month out from the peak of the uprising over George Floyd. And during the uprising, there were a lot of abolitionist demands that were being made. There were demands that the MPD and the SPPD be completely dismantled. There are demands that we invest millions in mental health services instead, investing in services like 311 and housing the homeless. I mean, people literally took over a hotel and then took over a park for the homeless population that was being displaced a lot during the protests. But now we're seeing a lot of those demands be muted, and we're seeing a lot of those demands shift. And so recently, the city council actually released a statement saying they didn't actually intend to dismantle the police department. They only intended to defund it, and they want to preserve some sort of a police system in Minneapolis still, which is starting to sound a lot more like a reform and a lot less like abolition. We're seeing homeless people being forced out by neighborhoods, and people who feel unsafe with people living near them who don't have houses. We're seeing a lot of corporations release Black Lives Matter statements, the value of which is questionable, but we know that those statements generally lead to profits and don't actually lead to the companies committing to diversity within their organizations or attending to Black or minority customers. And we are turning back to reform and moving farther and farther away from the possibility of that abolitionist moment that we saw during that time. And an prison abolitionist would argue that we are back to reforms and aren't seeing people actually take up abolition because we had reforms as a possibility during that moment. We, along with abolition, were like, reforms are cool too. And of course, the government is going to choose reforms because it means less change for them, it means less work for them, and it also means that they can maintain the oppressive structures that in some ways make the government function. You could think about how the government literally could not exist without Indigenous genocide and without slavery. And so this is a really wide and expansive question, which makes abolition a super versatile argument. You can run abolition as a critique of really any affirmative that is a reform, any affirmative that does not definitively say that we should get rid of prisons and police and the court system. But that is generally really insufficient for winning in a debate. What you want to do is you want to find specific links to the affirmative, meaning that you want to ask questions like, how does the affirmative end up strengthening the criminal justice system? Will the AF result in increased racial or gendered or economic disparities? What does the AF try to do that a community could do instead? Who does the AF leave behind? And so, for an example of this, a couple of years ago, there was an education topic, and desegregation asks were really popular on the topic. And desegregation is generally agreed upon in society as a pretty good idea. But I ran abolition against those affirmatives, and I would talk about things about like how desegregation often meant that Black teachers and administrators were fired, that curriculum often changed from being really culturally sensitive to the communities that the schools were serving to a standardized curriculum that didn't really attune or address minority history or needs, and how when Black people and students of color entered their new white schools, white peers and teachers were really racist towards them, and they suffered a lot of harm during that integration period. And we know today that schools are still segregated inside of themselves. If you go to an MPS high school, you are likely to notice during like lunchtime or even in classrooms that some spaces are majority minority and some spaces are majority white. There are always interesting impacts to affirmatives that even seem traditionally good that you should think about and point about when running abolition. And that critical thinking is really key to becoming a good abolition debater. The part that people tend to forget the most about with the abolition critique, but the part that is arguably like the most important, is the impact that the prison and police have on society. So the chart here shows the trajectory of mass incarceration. There are 1.6 million people in state and federal prison populations as of 2014. Right now, I believe there are currently 2.3 million people if you include jails, which are distinct from prisons. And so that incarceration has a lot of impacts within itself. It means that those people can't work. It means that they are subject to violence by prison guards and racially segregated gangs within prisons and sexual violence within prisons. It means they have family members and friends who have lost access to a valuable community member. It means that people continually face police brutality that can range from being murdered by the cops to being harassed by the cops on a daily basis. Part of this feeds into this everyday violence. You often hear specifically Black and Indigenous people talk about how they moderate their behavior, their dress, so that they decrease the chance that they'll get pulled over by the police. They decrease the chance that if they do get into an interaction with the police, that they come out unscathed, hopefully alive. And that's an enormous psychological violence to inflict on a person, to know that your life is suspect just because of your race, that your life can be taken away just because of your race. It's also important to note that prisons and police feed cycles of violence. We know that people don't generally come out of prison magically transformed. Prisons are not rehabilitative centers at all. They are sites of violence again. And when people come out, even if they want to generally better themselves and reintegrate into society, they are going to lack the opportunities to do so because they now have a criminal record. And for a lot of places, that will be a disqualifier for things like housing, things like food, things like voting. And then that turns back into crime. And that feeds again and again into a cycle of society. All of this points to the fact that prisons are part of white supremacy, and they are an integral part of white supremacy. Very obviously, you can see that in the rate of who is being incarcerated. Black men and Latinx men and Indigenous men are incarcerated at a rate way higher than white men, and the same goes for women and non-binary people. And getting rid of prisons is going to be integral. According to prison abolitionists, it's going to be necessary if we are ever to truly address racism in the US. And so the point of this is that when you run the prison abolitionist critique, you just don't want to say we should get rid of prisons because they're bad. You want to say we should get rid of prisons because they are a site of violence, they enforce a lot of violence, and they hurt a lot of people. And that's specificity. If you can point to specific instances in which the prison and policing systems have harmed people, that will help you a lot to make your case for why we should get rid of them. The final component I'm going to go over here is the alternative. The alternative for abolition generally has a couple of components, or a variety of these components, a mix of these components. So the first is a mindset shift. We know that we are indoctrinated into a culture that depends on prisons and police to keep us safe. We should know that we don't grow up seeing alternative solutions. And so part of prison abolition entails breaking out of that mindset and engaging in anti-racist and anti-homophobic, anti-prison and anti-cop, and generally anti-oppressive work within ourselves and within our communities. This can translate to physical things like refusing to call the cops. We also know that the prison and police systems are a product of racism. Since they descended from slavery. And in order to abolish them, we need to work towards abolishing racism generally. So whatever that may look like, that has to be included. A word you might hear sometimes when we talk about mindset shifts is epistemology. Epistemology means how we know what we know, which can seem really abstract, but think about how you come to form your opinions. You read books, you have conversations with friends, you probably watch the news. And part of abolition entails changing how we know what we know, so we are better able to imagine and then better able to implement an abolitionist future. The second component could include physical abolition. So that would be like literally abolishing prisons, literally getting rid of cops, and probably being like, we then return the money to communities who can use it to best serve their needs. Or maybe invest in practices like restorative justice. Physical alts are very literal, and that's why they're very easy to explain, but they aren't that easy to explain as you get further into debate, because it's kind of hard to think about how that would actually happen and to find like a 10-step plan for like how we get rid of prisons and cops. And who would be doing that? I don't think the government would be interested in just shutting down all of the prisons across the country. And that works where that kind of alternative generally gets bogged down. The third kind is a morality or ethical obligation. So that might say you have a moral obligation to reject the affirmative, or you might have to take an abolitionist ethic as a judge. These alternatives rely on the claim that prisons and cops are just bad sites, they're sites of violence, and that we may not be able to trigger society to have a giant mindset shift, and we may not be able to physically abolish, but within this debate round, the judge can make a moral decision, the judge can make an ethical decision that says that they reject the AF, and they understand that prison abolition is the desirable alternative and the only way to create change within society. And so an alt could feasibly include all three of these components, but an alt might just include two, it might just be one, but these are the things that you should be thinking about when you're explaining and crafting the alternative. So hopefully this gives you a general idea for how abolition is used in debate, and a general idea for how you can use abolition and create an abolition critique that is effective at answering your opponent's arguments. I'll be going a bit more in depth and then way more in depth in a couple of videos continuing this conversation that we'll release later this summer. But in the meantime, I would just suggest reading over abolition packets, abolition cards, Googling a bit, and seeing what you could find out by yourself in the meantime, because I think that will lead you to the most critical thinking and introspection. All right, thank you.